Cool. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in and watching us spit ideas and questions back and forth. Hopefully, as you know, we as STL Partners, we're doing a lot in the network API or telco API monetization space. And one of the most recent kind of products or tools that we've published is an update to our market sizing forecast, which we published in August this year, 2025. The previous iteration published in April or May 2024. And been at a few recent events, like the Aduna API Summit, CASA 25 in Amsterdam. And there's still a lot of talk about what is the potential market size, and there's some variation, let's say, between different analyst houses and consulting firms on what is the actual size of the market. And we thought it would be a good opportunity to have a bit of a discussion between myself and Yannick here on what does the STL model look like? How does it work? What are some of the changes that we've made in the forecast, and what do we think going forward the opportunity could look like? So as a quick intro, if you don't know who I am, I'm Darius. I'm one of the consulting directors at STL Partners, and I lead overall our work in an area called enterprise platforms. What's important, I suppose, for this is that NAS and Network APIs reports into me in terms of the topic area STL. But Yannick, I don't know if you want to do a quick intro.
Yeah, hi, I'm Yannick. I work across the sort of consulting and research side of STL. Again, mostly in the enterprise platforms area. So I look at APIs, but also data monetization and other sort of platform models. And I worked very closely in building this model bottom up, and of course the update.
Perfect. So I mentioned recently as STL Partners, we've been at a few different events talking about the network API theme, and market size does come up a lot. I wondered, given you've been very close to building the STL Partners model, if you could start with what is almost a bit of an intro to ours. What's it covering? Why might it look different or feel different from some of the others?
Yeah, so I guess the kind of particular aspect of our model that's maybe a bit different is that we start bottom up. So we really build the whole market from the use case level. So we start with devices. We kind of model out a whole bunch of use cases that might use APIs. Currently, that's at 44. So I think that's an increase of 10 since last forecast. So every year we review which use cases, and some of them fall out as they seem to maybe not be getting the same amount of traction, and others get added. And then we build up these endpoints for one country, build up demand, and then from the demand we try and we have a bunch of factors based on our own experience to work out what adoption might be of that demand, and then from there we build out the volume of demand for APIs and sort of attach a price to it. So we really go bottom up with our model. And the changes, I guess, since last year, as I said, we've had more use cases. We've also added APIs, so we follow closely what's happening with GSMA to kind of define the direction of the model that we're building. But not only GSMA, that's quite a crucial factor as well, is that our model encompasses work or assumed work that telcos are doing on APIs and are selling that aren't necessarily the Camara defined APIs.
Yeah, and I think that's quite an interesting point, because there are some operators that have been monetizing successfully in their market APIs for years, and it's just some of that will migrate to the Camara standard, and in other cases, until there's a standard, they'll be monetizing it as a kind of proprietary within the market.
I mean, a great example of that would be something like Camara recently released a footfall API and a population density. These are kind of two different APIs that are essentially trying to standardize some work that telcos have been doing for a while in footfall analytics and sort of aggregated footfall analytics. And so what we've tried to capture is, yes, the direct revenue stream from an API version of this, but it sort of captures the general demand for those services, and there are use cases in there for those analytics that kind of capture value that's probably beyond the very early stages that footfall analytics API is at.
That makes sense. Yeah, and I think that's another quite interesting and useful point, right? Is we're looking at APIs that are broader as well than just identity. So some of the footfall analytics stuff that we're building in, yes, telcos are already doing it, but it's covering location insights rather than actually covering pure identity and anti-fraud. And while there is an early opportunity in identity and anti-fraud, and telcos might crawl, walk, run in their approach and crawl by starting with kind of number verify and SIM swap before they walk into other APIs and then start running with things like QOD. It's not the be all and end all of the market opportunity that we forecast. And yeah, I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on how identity changes across the time period and where other growth, I suppose, from APIs and use cases will come from.
Sure. Yeah, well, identity APIs, as you say, are the big early opportunity. That's kind of what we came out with from the off with our previous model. And it's what we've seen in the year in between is that those are the ones that have had the limelight and that people are kind of telcos are pushing towards. And while that is true, and there is a big opportunity there, and maybe we can come on to that in a second, it's commoditizes quickly in our model. So we have sort of different models for each of the APIs as to how they develop, especially in terms of what you'd expect the pricing to be like, and the different channels. So our model does model whether you directly monetize APIs or whether you monetize them indirectly through aggregators. And anything that goes through aggregators, which is some of these number verify SIM swap APIs, tends to commoditize quickly, demand levels off, and the price starts to decline. And so that's why we're saying that actually there's a bigger opportunity beyond those APIs. And that includes in some use cases that are for identity APIs. So some of these sort of anti-fraud use cases begin with the opportunity with number verify and SIM swap, but actually later on in the period, there's an opportunity to put some location APIs in there. And that's a kind of secondary growth area that should already be thought about, even though there's this big pie to aim for first.
Interesting. And yeah, I think the location is the holy grail of telco data that they could monetize, right? And certainly some of the earlier deployments, as you mentioned, in location verification tend to be about a consumer endpoint or a consumer device and used in those anti-fraud use cases. But there's more fraught with consent management and consent capture challenges. What we also look at in the model, which I think is important for people to understand, is quite a big growth in B2B endpoint location validation or retrieval or hyper precise location or even geofencing. So you start looking at things like autonomous guided vehicles or fleet management and IoT tracking, or even the management of wide area IoT networks and utilities, for example. There's a big market around location data and eventually the IoT APIs like device management, device identifier, etc., that span much more into that B2B endpoint rather than pure anti-fraud. And we do think that's an interesting opportunity for telcos, and we've done a few presentations on that recently.
Yeah, and those opportunities get richer and richer as you go through the forecast because they have so many cross sells. As you say, one way into these is a private network solution or as an IoT sort of platform that you might build, and then you build on that incrementally with some location APIs, but then with, like you say, some device management APIs, and then eventually towards that sort of programmable network for really high value use cases.
Right. And then this starts to move us, as you mentioned before, away from the pure wholesale model, where you might see that steeper price decline, more of a commodity data point that you're sharing, and move more into kind of a differentiated, protected solution almost that's API driven, where you as an operator have a slightly stronger role or a different role in the ecosystem, or you're going to market joint with an SI or something like that in an enterprise space rather than, yeah, I'll just chuck this through Ado neural network as code and the distribution ecosystems on top. So I think that's an interesting point as well.
Absolutely. I think it's also worth mentioning, and this has become apparent over the past year. So, we compare the direct opportunity versus something easier perhaps through aggregators, but actually the opportunity through aggregators isn't obvious and isn't easy. So we've had to scale down our model in the past year because what we found is that telcos are moving quite slowly, even in this sort of obvious identity opportunity. So I think just to address that sort of decrease in those early years, it is because the supply side has been slow to move. I think we perhaps are still quite optimistic on those numbers. We think there's a big opportunity out there. We think the demand from the supply side is there. I mean, it's clear Google have talked about phasing out cookies by 2030, I think. And when that happens, if identity APIs are the next obvious choice, then that demand side, sorry, is there. Also, heard some other big digital players, TikTok, for example, trialing things in very small areas, and ready to move fast on that at a global scale. But again, the supply side is slow to react. So just to address the fact that we are still perhaps one of the more optimistic on direct revenues from APIs, it is because the demand side is there, and we're kind of putting almost an upper limit out there of what could be achieved if the supply side is ready to move.
Yeah, and both TikTok and Google presented at the Aduna API Summit, and both had a pretty clear message to kind of echo what you just mentioned, which is we're kind of ready to test and scale these in other markets beyond the pilots and the proof of concepts that we're doing. We just need telcos to move faster. We need that regional availability, otherwise we can't scale. And I think many of the providers that we've spoken to recently have said SMS, OTP, we want to remove by 2030. So a lot of the operators we speak to that are hesitant because they're saying, well, I've got to protect my SMS pie. Why would I move to the network API standard and start to quote unquote cannibalize those revenues? I think our rebuttal would be, well, those revenues will start to shrink because by 2030 it won't exist for some of these major players. So you need to start growing the next pie and making sure you get a fair share of it, because some of these players won't wait for the telco standard forever, right? They'll try it with a telco. If they don't have the availability or you move too slow, they'll circumvent the operator and find a different way to do it. So I think there is a sense of urgency there.
And actually, that conversation that you describe internally in a telco of not wanting to cannibalize SMS revenues kind of speaks to the slight misconception around APIs, and then their monetization that I think we come across quite a lot in the questions we get on this forecast, and that is to treat APIs as something of a product that can cannibalize SMS. I think that the APIs have to always be an enabler of other things, and actually the revenues that we forecast aren't necessarily going to be directly monetized as an income line. It might just be making a broader service better, or it might be pushing towards network as a service, which we see as the table stakes of where telcos are going. And so that's kind of another shift, and not to just spin up an APIs team that's another product team that's going to be competing with other products internally. It's more of a broader strategic shift across telcos that needs to happen.
Yeah, and I think in our model we look specifically at like private networks and edge, for example. But I think at the beginning you mentioned even a route to market for some of this through a strong IoT platform or an IoT business. So let's take a location retrieval, an IoT device wake up, a device roaming. All of these could be part of an IoT platform package. You wouldn't necessarily charge per API call for each of those APIs. It would be more, great, I've got a better IoT platform that's stickier for the customer, or where I can handle more devices. It's more scalable. It's moving even that IoT platform towards more as a service delivery models, et cetera, et cetera. So there we model an opportunity, but you may not directly monetize it as revenues. It may be part of your IoT business and your IoT route to market. And that's important for operators to consider.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
That makes sense. And I do think that's slightly different again from maybe some of the others that are on the market, which look purely at the API calls, looking a little bit at revenue enablement and different go-to-market models. I think is something that we at STL think is important, and we would push operators to have that multi-channel route to market, including some of your own direct through enterprises. And then there was an interesting point that someone raised recently, which we've spoken a bit about with Aduna, but not in lots of depth. But this is the idea of kind of APIs being bought back by enterprise units. So you wholesale it first to an aggregator like Aduna or Network as Code or the Bridge Alliance Exchange or whoever it is. And then an enterprise unit or some other solution unit would buy it back and stitch it together. Do you feel like operators will actually take that approach, or do you I don't know, build that ServCo model, let's say, so the infra co they wholesale it to aggregators and then the ServCo stitches it together into a solution?
Well, we have heard from the market that that's being envisaged. Not sure about anyone doing it just yet, but I think it is increasingly seen as a likely outcome. It will depend on the use case and on the API for sure. There are some use cases that really need global reach, or if not global reach, even market coverage. There's things that rely on for the customer, for the end consumer, that's there to be almost 100% coverage. And so for those, it almost seems like an obvious division of the value. But again, it relies on telcos having that split also internally, so they can kind of be in an infraco and monetize the APIs, or not monetize, but enable API way of doing things on that side, but then almost separately build a servco on top of that. That opens them up to competition from any other servco. It's they've got to prove their worth in that space, because it's no longer tied so specifically to their assets.
Yeah, and I guess in the sort of identity and anti-fraud space, which is the earlier one, you do have quite a strong competition ecosystem in that layer.
Absolutely.
Like Infobip, Cinch, Vonage, Cineverse, all of these players, Drulio, identity specialists, etc., that have presented on this topic. They're kind of the ones that are the servco in this case, and take those different APIs, package them into the anti-fraud solution for their customers, and make sure it works, and that kind of distribution side.
And we're already seeing a lot of telcos partner directly there. I mean, that seems to be the obvious choice in that space.
Yeah, but there may be some other cases, and we think location could be one, or that IoT, some of those device APIs could be another, where actually the strength of the asset and the strength of a telco existing route to market might mean you could build and compete more effectively in that solutioning. And I think we've got an article on it somewhere in the STL website, but the idea of the network as a gold mine, where if we think of the network as a gold mine and APIs as the gold ore that you mine from the network, you can make a good business by selling gold ore if you're heavily automated. You've got a really strong distribution ecosystem. You can work effectively through partners and operate on a very low margin, but you can effectively monetize that gold ore. And it is difficult for others to create mines because there's limited resource and takes a lot of capital to do that. But from the others that do have those mines, you're not that protected because you're not that close to the customer. So it tends to be, can I get this for the cheapest way? And then I'll create value on top. As you progress through the stage of refining that gold, so let's say you take it from gold ore into gold ingots and gold bars that can be melted down, you're adding a little bit of a wrapper maybe around SDKs, or you're stitching a couple of APIs together. You're providing more use case examples. You're providing more active education in the market to provide a bit of, use these ones, or I have a clear role to play here. But then the real value may come from taking the next step, which is turning that gold bar into the Rolex, or into the gold earrings or the bracelets, etc., where you're then close to the customer. You maybe have a brand that protects those margins, and you can charge based on the brand or the value created, not just based on the cost it took you to build the product. And I think that narrative of where the telcos play in that story, and picking which use cases you could actually move up that stack, is important. And again, another thing that we try and push in our research.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a kind of final point on that, I mean, even within the identity space, sort of anti-fraud space, yes, there is that kind of clear route with partnerships with the sort of CPaaS market, but there will always be instances with customers that you might, as a telco, have a close relationship with. So within the financial sector, if there are one or two banks that dominate the market and that needs a sort of closer integration of the service, then there's good opportunities there. I know there's been some successful POCs in Brazil, for example, where it's been a real one large customer kind of deal. And also going further, but identity services to governments and all that. There's evidence there that telcos can be placed to be a bit more of a direct, serve higher up that value chain and actually create a service wrapper.
Perfect.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. So I guess just to wrap up, we're sort of saying, look, we at STL, we model from the use case. We've got 46 use cases that we look at in detail, where we feel like APIs could play a role, and we build up from there, looking at 4G, 5G, edge, private network, IoT based use cases, and understanding where could APIs play a role. We still see that there's big demand, even though we've decreased that forecast considerably in the earlier years, that primarily coming from a supply side slowness, let's say, and telcos maybe being a bit too hesitant again, and wanting to protect SMS, or not seeing enough of a market to date. But actually there is urgency, because big players like TikTok, Google, they're ready to move once they've got that availability. And then we spoke a little bit about the fact that in the model we do look at other monetization routes beyond just volume times price or that transaction model, then you need to think a little bit about revenue enablement and even things that we don't model in this forecast because it gets too complex, but thinking about subscription models or time and performance based models, and even eventually how again you go to market through your IoT business and what models do you have there around stickiness, etc. So thinking about enablement but also those other routes to market. And then the final point being, where do you want to monetize the APIs? Is it as the infraco where you're effectively monetizing that gold ore, the raw material, or is it actually starting to build more solutions and stitching this together for enterprise customers where you can build a slightly different relationship and route to market?
Yeah. And increasingly those last two are not mutually exclusive. You can sort of do both separately, even, buy back to build those services together.
Perfect. Well, thanks for your time. I'm sure we'll end up doing a few more of these ad hoc conversations to try and share more of our insights on this as a topic. And for anyone that has watched or has listened, if you've hopefully got my email or you can connect with us through the web, do ask us questions. We're very happy to jump on a call and deep dive into any of this and talk more through our methodology or our thinking in this space. So yeah, do please get in touch. And thanks, Yannick, for your time.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.